managing up, it has so much more breadth and depth than any one of those kind of high-level statements can capture. Managing up is something you do primarily for yourself, so you can feel more confident, more in control, the sense of authority, freedom, autonomy over your work that you deserve.
Understanding your manager's pain points tells you where they're going to be particularly anxious, where they need extra information, where they're likely to want to dig in deeper for details, where you need to be super cautious.
It's so much easier for your leader to react to something tangible than it is many times to stay in this kind of esoteric, high-level conversation. Your manager is a person too. They're an imperfect person in an imperfect system, and they have pressures and priorities, and they're having conversations that you're not privy to, and they may not be withholding from that out of malice. It's just they have so many plates spinning, they may not think to tell you.
There is no growth in comfort and no comfort in growth. Yet the big leaps are how careers are made and how businesses excel. So how do you master not knowing at all or feeling like an imposter? How do you have the conversations that lead to trust and, of course, excellence? How do you take charge of the things that you can control? How do you thrive outside your comfort zone? That's what this podcast is about. I'm your host, Wanda Wallace, and it's time to get out of your comfort zone. Welcome to the conversation. Today we're talking about managing up. Now, you know that that's necessary for career progress, and I'm going to tell you it's an art form. Some people do it really well, and some others don't do so well at it. So we're going to level the playing field. I don't care how skilled you are at it, how important you think it is, or any variation on the theme. We're going to give you a review of the critical conversations you need to have. And all of those are going to help you raise your visibility, take ownership, say no, and a whole lot more. So my guest today is Melody Wilding. She is a best-selling author of a book called Trust Yourself, Stop Overthinking and Channel Your Emotions for Success at Work. We certainly need that one. And the book we're talking about today, Managing Up, How to Get What You Need from the People in Charge. Melody's background is as a licensed social worker with a master's degree from Columbia. She's also a professor of human behavior at Hunter College in New York City and a former emotions researcher at Rutgers University. She's been helping top performers and leaders at some of the world's most successful companies like Google, JP Morgan, and Verizon communicate more clearly, prevent burnout, and transform complicated work dynamics into powerful alliances. A regular feature in all the usual publications like New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Harvard Business Review, Forbes, Fast Company, and the list goes on. Melody, it's great to be talking to you today.
Thank you so much, Wanda. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm looking forward to it. And I have to say, I really do love the book, Managing Up. The conversations in this one are they're beautifully structured. They've got enough nuance to actually deal with some of the complexity I see in those complicated conversations with your manager. So highly recommend it. And that's about as strong of an endorsement as I can give on my podcast. Any rate, why? Why did you get started? So you've been doing things around emotions and around trust yourself and around preventing burnout. What got you started on this managing up issue?
Well, you mentioned my first book, Trust Yourself. That came out in 2021. So really during the height of the pandemic. And as we all remember, everything was in upheaval at that point. We were in the middle of the Great Resignation. We were all kind of rethinking and updating how we related to our work. And I kept hearing a couple things from people over and over again. Number one, the pace of change was out of this world. And even to this day, I was just talking with a client this week who said she's on her 6th boss in 4 years. And I think that is just symptomatic of what so many people are going through. Reorg after reorg, priorities are changing every day. You may have a new manager. And I was hearing from people this feeling of just being at the whim of everything that was happening around them, whether it was these changes, it was the personalities, it was the politics, and really feeling like they were on their back foot instead of in the driver's seat, lacking this sense of agency in their work. And then also when Trust Yourself came out, which, as the name suggests, is about believing in your skills, your capability, people would say, okay, I feel more secure in the value I bring to the table. But the situation where all of this starts to break down is when I have to deal with those that have more authority than me. And I lose my words. I don't know how to communicate at that executive level or navigate some of those nuances that you were mentioning. And they would blame themselves and they would say, oh, well, I'm just an overthinker. I'm a people pleaser. I need to set better boundaries. And they would blame themselves, which to some extent is true. We do have to manage ourselves before we attempt to manage others. But I kept seeing again and again how so many of their struggles came down to lacking this skill set of managing up. That, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, that many times the difficulties that we have with other people come down to a difference in how we might approach something versus our manager's communication style or approach. And once we can see that more clearly and we have some tools to navigate it more effectively, a lot becomes a lot easier. You become more successful.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's no question that the stresses are high and that they've been high for a really long time. That's why your first book probably hit so well, because people were in this tailspin of emotions and how do I deal with it? But one of the big struggles is the manager relationship or the manager's manager relationship. And if that isn't going well, every part of your work life is in a bit of chaos. So I think those relationships are really critical. Now, when you say managing up, often a lot of people think about schmoozing or about, other phrases that we could put to that, where I'm pulling one over on the boss's eyes. That's not exactly what you mean. So tell us what you mean by managing up.
Not at all. Yes. And most of us grew up in a time where we equated managing up with sucking up, with ingratiating ourselves. And we have that picture of the person running behind the manager with coffee spilling all over the place. And they say jump and you ask how high. That's professional people pleasing. That is not managing up. And so what I say in the book, and I firmly believe this, I think you'll probably agree with me, is that managing up is something you do primarily for yourself. So you can feel more confident, more in control. You can have the sense of authority, freedom, autonomy over your work that you deserve. A nice byproduct of it is that it can make your manager look good. That's a nice byproduct of it, but that's not the main driving force. And that's how we've been taught to think about it. And I think another thing you were mentioning, you hit on something very important, which is that our relationships with our leaders are not only the most important in the workplace, influential there, but also for our overall mental health. There have been, since the pandemic, more studies looking at this, and they have found that your relationship with your manager can have a bigger impact on your mental health than that of the relationship you have with your doctor, your therapist, and almost as much as you have with your spouse. And so that's how important it is to really make sure that you're building trust, rapport, that you are able to command respect. And another wrinkle or layer to all of this is that we need to think beyond our direct manager. I'm sure many of the companies and organizations that you speak to are matrixed. And people may have one functional lead and then a project lead for something else. They may also have kind of a quote unquote boss at a client or a vendor that they have to be able to influence. And you were mentioning also your manager's manager. And so it's also a mistake if we think about managing up in this kind of limited, pigeonholed, oh, I just need my relationship with my direct supervisor to click into place and everything will be fine. We need to think so much further beyond that in terms of our visibility, our advancement, how we're building our reputation.
Right. If you think about most of modern organizations and most work, it's much more project oriented. So in one form or another, I'm on one project, one deal, one assignment, and the who is the most senior person on that project will rotate. So all of those are relationships to manage. I love your definition that managing up is not to manage to make look good or to make happy. It's to give me more control in those relationships. So what a great phrase. All right, now I happen to love the framework of the book. In fact, spoiler alert, my next book coming out next year is really around key questions. So I just love the way that you've done this with the 10 conversations that you need to structure in order to have the right kind of relationship with your superiors. Kind of just list those for me and give me a quick highlight about what each one is. And then I want to take a deep dive into a few of them.
Sure. And let me explain why I did it this way. Is because I'm not sure if you've had this experience, but certainly I did in my career. And I hear this from clients again and again, that we're given feedback in a performance review, or a mentor says, it would really benefit you if you learn how to influence without authority or navigate your relationships across the organization. We're told that. And then in the very next breath, we're given these basic, pithy, catchy one-liners of be proactive, get in their head, make them look good, come with solutions, not problems. And those are directionally helpful and they are correct to a certain extent, but they're overly simplistic because, well, what does it mean to come with solutions, not problems? And how do I do that in a way that doesn't feel like I'm stepping on my leader's toes? And there's all these nuances, and managing up is so much more. It has so much more breadth and depth than any one of those kind of high-level statements can capture. And so I wanted to create this 10 conversations framework to really make it more sticky for people to understand, how do I take some of these invisible dynamics and maybe unspoken rules and actually distill them down into something that feels tactical, but also have a methodology that I can follow. And so that's where the 10 conversations came from. And as you said, there are 10. The first 5 are the most foundational. And so we're talking about things like alignment, styles, ownership, boundaries, and feedback. And then once we have those foundational ones, those pave the way for the more advanced ones, the latter 5, which are visibility, networking, advancement, money, and then finally the quitting conversation, because even when you have one foot out the door, you still need to manage your relationships.
I love it. I love it. I wish we could dive into all of them. There are 4 that I particularly love because they're the 4 that I find people most often get wrong or overlook. And you're going to find that 3 of them are the more foundational, and then I got 1 on the advancement. And granted, we could talk about the money and promotion and all those, but let me stick with my favorite list out of this one. I want to start with your first one, which is the alignment conversation. When I started reading this, it strikes me that alignment is really very straightforward. We've got a mission, we got a set of objectives, we got a goal, okay, great, we're aligned. But actually, it's not nearly that complicated. So walk us through this disconnect that sometimes happens between the boss and the direct report when you don't really understand what your boss is asking you to do.
Yes.
Or what they really intended by what they said, above and beyond the yearly goal for the group.
Yes. And there's so many layers to this, right? Your manager is a person too. They're an imperfect person in an imperfect system, and they have pressures and priorities, and they're having conversations that you're not privy to. And they may not be withholding from that out of malice. It's just they have so many plates spinning. They may not think to tell you the executive sponsor in this meeting now wants to go a different direction. And it may just not come up in conversation yet. When we then squirrel away working on a project that we agreed to at the beginning of the quarter, and then we come back a couple weeks later and our manager says, oh, we've changed. We've changed directions from that. And then you feel like, well, how did I waste so much time? And that's where some of that friction can start to come up. And so the alignment conversation, we have to go just past the surface level of what are our key priorities to try to get one layer deeper in the onion to understand what are some of our managers, maybe unspoken or not fully articulated pressures, goals, pain points, and also be having this conversation in a lightweight way more frequently as things are quickly evolving and changing. And so, yes, as you were saying, I'm hoping everyone here is doing, whether it is annual or biannual, maybe even quarterly goal setting with their manager. That should be a baseline here. But as I mentioned, we want to go deeper than just, well, what are our key priorities? So in that chapter, there's a number of questions I recommend to how do you get under the hood a little bit more. And one of my favorites there is either asking some version of, what are the metrics you're asked about most often? Or what are the metrics you and your manager talk about most often? Because it could be the same as what you assume it might be, or it could be different. And asking that gives you almost instant clarity to what your manager is going to be aligned with, what they may be putting time, budget, extra oversight on, where they may seem a bit more micromanagey on you because it's important to them and how they are being evaluated. So I'll pause there because I know you love
Yeah.
questions. You might have some thoughts about this.
Oh, I have 1,000 ones. I can always make commentary, not necessarily that it's a value added, but I can always make it. Yes. And I find sometimes with managers, like a shift will happen usually at the end of the year as you're thinking forward to the next year, where you say, this group isn't really hitting the mark in this particular area the way I want them to hit the mark. And you have a conversation with your manager's manager now, and you sort of shift and say, well, great, let's look at this new metric as a result to try to keep people on track or accountable or doing a different thing. Okay. So the metrics can shift and you don't even necessarily know that they shifted. And then you can be misaligned. The other thing that I see, especially as I talk with lots of managers about how do they hold their team accountable, one of the things I start with, it's got to be crystal clear what goal we're trying to achieve, and it has to be mutually understood. Most of the time, managers will say, go do blah, 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 blah. But that may mean something different to you than it did to the manager. You may have heard the details. You may not have heard it. They may have not said it clearly. Just stopping to say, wait, let me make sure I understand what you're talking about is a useful exercise. Even with the best of intentions, this can go off track.
Yes. And what does success look like? If you flash forward and getting them to imagine it almost like a movie, if you flash forward 3 months, we're having this conversation again, what would you like to say had been possible by that point? Or what would you like to be reporting to the board? That can really help them get into the nitty gritty. And another one of my favorite questions in there is to ask, what does good performance look like? And let them answer. And then say, okay, great, very helpful. What does great or excellent performance look like? Because that's how you can push past some of the baseline to get at also what are some of maybe the behavioral aspects that they may be evaluating someone's success on, or they may be looking for in a top performer that are not go past the technical or the skills aptitude. It may be, well, I want to make sure we have someone who, when that difficult stakeholder brings up an objection, feels comfortable asking them a question in that circumstance. You need to know how to be able to handle yourself with some of those difficult personalities. That may not come out in the just baseline metrics conversation.
Right. All right. You also do in the book this notion of sometimes it's handy to do a preview of what you think you're going to do. Sometimes you have a manager that doesn't really quite know what they were looking for, and so a preview helps them refine that. Sometimes you just want to check that you're on track, and it's not that you have to go all the way to do perfection, but that you do an outline or a start or a sketch. And say, am I on the right track? Is this the kind of thing that you were looking for? I really like that approach, especially when it's ambiguous directions.
Yes, exactly. And this works for a few reasons, right? Especially if you counterintuitively, if you do work with someone that maybe a bit more critical or a bit more on the micromanager side, this prevents, usually what we do is we do that squirrel away and let me try to dot every I and cross every T so that this is totally immune to that person's feedback, and let me present it once I feel it is perfect. And then we come back to that person and they say, well, I don't like this. And why did you make this decision? And so if you can come with that sketch and say, based on what I understand that has been a priority for you in the past and the types of considerations I should be making, here's how I'm considering approaching this, or here's a skeleton of the deck or the pitch for the client. What is this missing? And at least you can surface some of that then, so you don't waste a lot of time going in the wrong direction. And when it comes to managing up, one of the best strategies you can employ is saving your leader cognitive energy. Your boss will love you for that because they already have enough on their plate. If you can help them think less or process less, amazing. And what's good about that is that then you have more say and sway in shaping the direction that something takes or the narrative. And so it's so much easier for your leader to react to something tangible than it is many times to stay in this kind of esoteric high level conversation. It's much easier for them to say, I don't like the messaging here. Let's do this a little differently there than, like you were saying, to say in abstracts and non-specifics.
Right. Yeah. And I want to highlight one thing that you said earlier too, just before we leave this section and go to the next one, which is in the alignment conversation. Understanding your manager's pain points tells you where they're going to be particularly anxious, where they need extra information, where they're likely to want to dig in deeper for details, where you need to be super cautious. And that's just enormously helpful when you're trying to deliver your best results. All right, let's shift. I want to talk about the styles conversation. And I happen to love your me manual. So walk me through the styles conversation, and then we'll talk about the me manual.
Yes. Styles is probably my favorite conversation in the entire book because it's so immediately useful. And I was alluding to before this idea that oftentimes what we perceive as difficult behavior in the workplace often comes down to a matter of difference. And that is most true when we were talking about communication styles. That what we perceive as someone being overly critical, or why are they poking holes in my thinking? Why can't they give me clear direction to save their life? Most of the time that comes down to a difference in how we process information, our preferences, our approach to the work. And so that's why it's so important to understand styles so that you can decode and take less personally someone else's behavior. But the other side of it, which we'll get to, is being able to communicate and assert your preferences and approach. And so when we're talking about style, there's, broadly speaking, two different dimensions to this. And there have been so many research studies that have proven this over the years, many different models based on this. The one I use in the book, I call the 4 C's. And so we have dominance, that is one dimension, which is how much control does someone like to have in a situation? How quickly do they like to move? And then the other dimension is sociability. How much do they prioritize relationships, building rapport with others? You map those high, low on each, you get 4 C's. And so you may work for someone who's a commander, which is high dominance, low on sociability. That is someone who moves very quickly. They're very focused on results, outcome. They, if you're speaking to them, you want to focus on the bottom line, limiting the context. And then we have a cheerleader. A cheerleader also high on dominance. So they move quickly, they aim high, but they're also high on sociability. So that is someone who you'll appeal to more if you share stories, if you use terminology like vision, mission, opportunity, possibility. They tend to be a bit warmer, more enthusiastic. They can also be a bit more hung up on reputation and optics. And then we have the caretaker. This is kind of the opposite of the commander. So they are high on sociability, low on dominance. This person moves a bit slowly. They tend to be more cautious. They need more time to warm up to things. They value stability and harmony. So this is the person that wants more context. They want consensus first before moving ahead with anything. And then last is the controller. That's someone who's low on both of the dimensions. And that person is usually very attuned to precision, excellence. They think of things in terms of systems, methodologies, standards. They don't like to take risks. They can sometimes seem a little bit rigid, but they're the type of person that will dot every I, cross every T. And they may ask a lot of questions, not because they're trying to necessarily nitpick, but that's how they process. And that's how they thoroughly understand the data and what's driving a decision. So once you understand those, you can say, oh, now I see maybe I'm a caretaker, and why I tend to, if I'm saying something to my boss, I tend to lead with the context. Here's how we got here. Here's all the considerations I made. Who's on board. And now I understand why my manager cuts me off and says, yeah, I don't need any of that. Just tell me what decision you need from me. And instead of taking it personally, we can make very selective, strategic adjustments to lead with our bottom line, to say, here's the decision I need from you. I have other details I could share, but I wanted you to have that information up front. And it just makes everything so much more smooth for them and for us.
Yeah. We could argue, I mean, those are two great dimensions. There's no question. The control dimension and the relationship dimension are really powerful. And we can quibble about whether there are others that matter or don't matter. But for the starting point, the whole purpose here is making sure you understand your leader's preference in how they think, process information, communicate, what they're going to worry about. Like risk taking, are they going to worry about it and how or not? Conceptual, are they going to worry about or not and how? So if you know that, then you know what to say to them, as you just rightly said. But I think the reason I like the Me Manual so much is because you give much more detail in the kind of things you want to know about you. So explain the Me Manual, and then we'll dive into it a little bit deeper.
Yeah, the Me Manual is for the other side of the coin, which is being able to articulate and assert your own style. And it's essentially a way for you to create a operating guide to you as a professional. And there's a bunch of different prompts to work through in the book, but we've talked about some of them here. How do you like to process information? Do you want questions in advance of a meeting so you can think about them? How do you like to give and receive feedback? Are you the type of person that really likes to work on one meaty project? Do you like to be spread across a couple of things? What are some of your limitations around even things like your work hours? All of that goes into your Me Manual. And this could be something you share with your leader. And I have many people that do that. Of course, you have to read the room and understand the culture you're operating in. But more times than not, I've never heard anybody tell me they regretted sharing their Me Manual with their leader. Most leaders are very relieved to have it, especially if you approach it from the perspective of, I want us to work together successfully, and I want you to have the best performance out of me possible. And here are some things I've gleaned about myself over the years. And I can't tell you also how many leaders have said, this is great. Can I use this? Or could we do this with the entire team? Because it would be really helpful to have this for everyone, just to eliminate some of that conflict. So you can share it outright like that. You can just take pieces out of it. So a classic example is a feedback conversation where I always recommend that you should bring up with your leader, we're going to have times where we don't see eye to eye, or there's something I want to give you feedback on. What's the best way for me to do that? What would your preference be? And you let them answer. And then you say, again, great, helpful. For me, here's what I have found has worked best for me in the past, what I've learned working on other projects and with other leaders. So it becomes more of a two-way conversation rather than you just reacting to and responding to, becoming a chameleon for whatever your boss wants.
What's nice about this and about the structure of the conversations is we have that conversation before there's a problem. Like the feedback conversation before there's a problem, the communication conversation before there's a problem. And that means that when there's a problem, we've got something to fall back on. So remember when I said that I really like this. I think I missed this for you this time. Can we regroup? I mean, there's just a dozen ways you play it, but if you haven't set up that manual in effect, then it's harder to come back to those points and kind of regroup or reposition or wind back something you said that maybe you didn't want to say. And whether you share the manual as, here's my written document, or whether you just share the manual verbally, I don't think it matters all at one time, over time. I think there's just a lovely exercise there in thinking about yourself. Mm-hmm. And then it gives you a set of questions to ask about somebody else. How wonderful. So the group I was with this morning was saying, how do we get better soft skills? And it's like, we'll start with self-awareness. There's a good way to start. And then you got to get to know the other person who's quite different than you. That's the place to start. It's a brilliant, brilliant way to go with it. Can't recommend it enough. All right, let's talk next about the boundaries condition. The one that scares everybody to death because you're basically going to tell your boss, no, I'm not doing that. So walk us through how this works.
Well, I have a bit of a hot take on this, which is that no is not a complete sentence in the workplace. That may be true in every other aspect of life, but if you just imagine, Wanda, if you asked a colleague or one of your team members to help you out with something and they just said, no, you'd be like, what did I do to upset them? This person is being insubordinate, right? It doesn't go over well. So we need to be more tactful and diplomatic with how we deliver that pushback. And of course, there are also other considerations here where we need to, for gender, for racial reasons, there's all this intersectionality about that factors into how we have to walk this fine line between being a team player and being a pushover, and that takes finesse. So with the boundaries conversation, I always recommend, we're talking a lot about questions today, and questions are a huge power move in so many aspects of work and life. And they come in handy here too, where instead of just that outright refusal, you engage the person by asking questions first. This buys you time to manage your own inner reaction about what's happening instead of just snapping at the person, or just, a lot of us who are recovering people pleasers, we have that knee jerk, yeah, sure, I can do it. We don't even process before we have said yes. And so instead of either of those extremes, ask some questions about what's the actual timeline. You said you need this soon. What's the actual timeline for that? Or what's driving the urgency here? Can you help me understand what factors went into this? Who else will this be visible to? Who else is involved? Do you think that this is going to be something that's a one-time need or something that could potentially be ongoing, because that will help us gauge our bandwidth? So those types of questions, they also help you clarify the request, because you may not know on the surface level, it could be something that's really valuable for you or your team because it gives you exposure to a different department or a different skill set. You may want to make a concession to say, yes, we can fit this in. So ask questions first. But nevertheless, of course, there's going to be times where we're just being given more than we can handle. And there's several different frameworks in that chapter. The one I find is most useful in most situations is called the trade-off approach, which is essentially you are saying, if we add this, then something else has to give. And it operates on the psychology of forced choice, where you are creating a frame for the discussion and you're making it more of a binary instead of just, no, we won't do this. You're saying, okay, I hear this new thing is being added. If we do that, that's going to push back this other timeline. Are you okay with that? Or what would you like us to deprioritize or reprioritize? Here's my suggestion. Are you happy for us to move ahead with that? And so you position yourself as more of a partner and a collaborator rather than just someone who's shutting it down.
Yeah. I like that forced choice thing, because if you say to a manager, the priority questions, like, I can't do everything, so what's your most important priority, or what thing falls off the plate? Most managers are going to say nothing falls off the plate. Priorities are still the same. And you haven't gotten an answer. But if you say, because they're not thinking about it, they're just reacting in the moment. And again, it's heavy cognitive load. So as you said earlier, we don't want to make it hard on the manager. So I can do this, yes, for sure. But it means this is a little slower than I had planned. That's a forced choice, A or B. I love it. It's a great way to think about how do you say no, or how do you negotiate the boundaries on it.
Yes.
One of the other ones, and I think you have this one in the book too, that I like, is this notion of quality. Yes, I can give you an approximation of this, but I can't give you a full-blown perfect thing. So, like, can you take this? Is that okay? But let's be clear, it's an approximation. It won't be perfect.
Correct. Yeah. And this is a strategy. It's actually called the positive no, where instead of leading with what you can't do, you say what you can do. Okay, I hear this is important. What I can do is have a draft, or I can have a spec for you by this time, instead of, we can't do that, which again, it's subtle, but you're approaching it more collaboratively as a problem solver, and you're not triggering someone's loss aversion. Loss aversion is one of the strongest human levers. We don't want to feel like something's being taken away from us or we're being deprived of it. So if you say this is what we can do, then it's much more of a relief to the other person. Yeah.
Right. And sometimes I find also what managers are looking for is not the full-blown project that they've asked you for. They want a hint in a direction. Like, they want to know, would this work? as an approach, which is a very different question than write a report for me that's 20 pages long justifying the business case for this. So those sorts of questions in negotiation help you get to what's really actually needed. And we're back to the alignment conversation. Okay, I'm going to move out of the foundational territory and take one in the secondary, which is the advancement conversation. And granted, this is tied up with visibility and network and pay, but it's the advancement that I like the most. So walk me through how this conversation goes.
Yes. And yes, as you said, I loved how you pointed out that even boundaries goes back to alignment. You can see how all these start to interlock and play with one another. With advancement in particular, the biggest mistake I see, and we're having this conversation in mid-June. So many organizations are coming up on mid-year reviews, or depending on your cycle, some are doing annual reviews. And so it's good timing for us to be having this conversation. And the biggest mistake I see people fall into here is the performance review paradox, which is we wait and we save up our request for how we want to move forward or what we want to take on for that like big formal conversation. And by that point, it's too late. The budget has been allocated, the headcount has been assigned, the conversations have already been had. So if you're waiting till that point, and many times we don't want to rock the boat, our manager is busy, it feels awkward to bring it up, but you're doing them a disservice and yourself. So the key takeaway in that chapter is we need to think about seeding our aspirations early and often. Again, not in a heavy-handed sort of way, but so that it's not an afterthought and it can be accounted for in planning. And so let's take the example. I'm sure you and I have worked with a lot of people that may want to go from, let's say, director to VP. You might approach your manager and say, I would like to have this different title by the end of the year. What do you need to see in order to make that possible? And so you're floating the conversation. You can gauge the reaction. You can also gauge what objections they may have. You may find out, I had a client who did this, and what she found out is that she needed a organizationally sanctioned mentor who was not her manager in order to go through the promo process. And she was like, wow, I never knew that. And she had been in the organization for so many years. And so finding out who else needs to be involved, what they need to see to gauge your readiness, so that you're basically creating a checklist for you to meet that periodically, hopefully once a quarter, you can sit down with your manager to say, all right, in March, we agreed on this. And so far I've done boom, boom, and boom. Are we still on track for that? Has anything changed? Again, instead of it being this afterthought, you're just mapping with it. It becomes kind of just a natural conclusion that happens.
Right. And this is also back to the alignment conversation that you started with, because if you've had that alignment conversation and one of the questions you've asked is what does good look like and what does great look like, you got some clues already about what your manager is looking to see next. And that is a good, in the the advancement conversation, that can be a good starting place well before the year you think that this is the year I want to advance. And figuring out who else is involved and what the process looks like and what the timeline looks like. And are there any other criteria I need to know? And how do I stack up relative to the other people that might be up for the same kind of advancement? All of that is useful data to know kind of what your expectations can be and what you need to do differently.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It's great. Well, that is only 4 conversations, and there are 6 more. So, Melody, without a doubt, what a fabulous book. Melody Wilding is my guest, and the book, again, is Managing Up, How to Get What You Need from the People in Charge. Again, not for the purposes of manipulating, not for the purposes of pleasing, but for the purposes of you being able to take more ownership, control, autonomy over the work that you're contributing. I love the book. So if somebody were trying to find you, Melody, where's the best way to find you?
You can head to managingup.com. You'll find all the information about the book there. And there's a form on that page. Just enter your order number. We have a vault of digital versions of things like the Me Manual. We have a reference guide for those 4Cs, all different scripts and templates from the book.
I love it. Fabulous. What a great book. Melody, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
And join us again next week. Also, we love to hear from you, so go to outofthecomfortzone.com, submit a note. We loved hearing from you, or on your favorite podcast provider. You can send an email or a note or whatever. We'll be sure to get back to you. See you next week.